Okay, welcome back, guys. We're going to go through today, and we're continuing with metabolism, but we're going to be talking about anabolic reactions. Okay, so the reactions that require energy. Now, just before we get into that, if you'll notice, there's only one lecture posted this week. It's a longer lecture, but I'm trying to compromise. If you read your email yesterday, the directors kind of informed us that we're giving you too much work, and I know that I'm giving you a decent amount of work. I hope that it's reasonable. I'm just trying to get you guys as prepared as possible. Okay, I don't want to give you tons of work because I'd love to not do very much work either. It's just I feel horrible if I don't prepare you guys for the next year. And next year they are going to have this in mind that we're not getting a full education. It's just I want to prepare you as much as possible. So I'm trying to do this compromise between not giving you too much work because I understand you guys have a whole bunch of different things going on and you didn't sign up for an online class, and this is just overall it's a really crappy situation. But I'm trying to also recognize that in this crappy situation, I still am obligated to make sure that you're ready or as ready as possible. So if you are feeling overwhelmed, just let me know. It's just I want to make sure that anybody who is willing to keep up with what we're going through, they have that opportunity. But I will try and lighten it slightly. Okay, so that being said, we're going to go through photosynthesis introduction today. Now, this isn't the most exciting thing. And again, one of the challenges in university and in life really is, can you focus on things that aren't interesting? So myself, I'm not a huge interest in photosynthesis, but that's the challenge in life. If life was just going through and all you had to do was pay attention to things that you loved, well, that would make life really, really easy. The challenge is can you pay attention and can you work on things and care about things and try on things that don't necessarily interest you? And if you are that type of person, that's why you get to go on to university and we give you high responsibility roles. It's because we know that you're going to do a good job on something that may not interest you. If you are one of those people that only does things that they like, then that's a normal thing to do. It's just we can't give you a really high responsibility job because in doing so, we know that if it's something comes in that you don't like, you just won't do it. So an example would be like a doctor, right? So if a doctor comes in when a patient has horrible BO, okay, you have to treat that person. We're not going to allow you to become a doctor if when that person comes in, you're just like, oh, that person stinks, I'm not going to treat them. Okay? You have to be willing to do the things that you may not necessarily love because it's the good for the better of people. Okay, so one of them is, let's try and pay attention through this lecture. Okay. So anabolic reactions. Let's just do a little bit of a recap. So metabolism refers to catabolic reactions, the ones that release energy, and anabolic reactions. Now, last week and the week before, we kind of discussed the main catabolic reactions, which is cellular respiration. And we went through both the times that you use oxygen, the great times, which is aerobic, and then the problem when we don't have enough oxygen and we use anaerobic, and that leads to lactic acid buildup, and it leads to fatigue, and so on. Okay, so this week, we're going to discuss the most important anabolic reaction, the ones that require energy, and that's photosynthesis. Now, this is the most important reaction because it's the only reaction where you can turn sunlight into chemical energy, food. All it is just a conversion. You're converting one energy form to the other. You can't create energy or destroy it. All it is just a whole bunch of energy transformations. If you love that, go into physics. Okay, but this energy transformation is taking radiant energy, which is light energy, and then putting it into the bonds of a glucose molecule. And now these bonds store a whole bunch of energy, which we eat and then convert to ATP, which is our usable form. And again, it's just energy transformations. Okay, so we've previously discussed anabolic reactions such as DNA replication. We didn't mention it, that you're requiring energy to do this because it was already complicated on its own. But when we replicate DNA, you're taking simple molecules like bases, like A's and C's and T's and G's, and you're putting them together into this really big complex molecule, and that requires energy. So that's an anabolic reaction. Cell division, if you're going to create a new cell, you're going to take a whole bunch of macromolecules and assemble them into this giant cell, which is going to require energy. Protein synthesis, when we make proteins, we take all these amino acids and we assemble them into a chain, making a polypeptide. That requires energy. So all these reactions, like I just mentioned, take simple molecules like amino acids or bases or macromolecules to create more complex ones. Okay? And this requires energy. And we get this energy from cellular respiration. Okay? Now, to backtrack a little bit, Okay, where did glucose get its energy from? If we get our energy from glucose and macromolecules, where did glucose get its energy from? Okay, and how did this complex molecule form? If the molecule required energy to form, where did that energy come from? Well, this is all answered in this topic, photosynthesis. Okay, so just to simply going over photosynthesis, during this process, radiant energy, okay, is another known as light energy, so it's kind of a combination of light and heat, is used to convert low energy compounds, CO2, so these really simple molecules, CO2 and water, into a high energy compound, glucose. Okay, and so this glucose is really more complicated, and inside all of those bonds is all of the energy that used to be in the sunlight is now trapped inside these bonds. Okay? Now this process only uses about 1 to 2% of the radiant energy. Most of the energy coming down, it's not get absorbed and turned into glucose. It mostly just kind of gets reflected back or absorbed by the earth. But its contribution is enormous, right? Even though it's a small amount. So there's few organisms that are able to do this. Okay, if you remember grade 11, okay, green plants is what everybody thinks is the only thing that can do photosynthesis. They're not the only thing, because green plants evolved after our first thing that was able to do it, which is cyanobacteria. Remember, if we go back, plants evolved after cyanobacteria, so these were the first things that were able to do it. Okay, cyanobacteria, and then bacteria evolved into, if we remember, protists. Okay, and protists were also before plants because they're like single-celled organisms. So algae, which everyone thinks is a plant, it's not. It's actually a protist. Okay, so these two things were the first things that were able to photosynthesize, and then eventually they turned into kind of our amazing photosynthesizer, the plant. Okay, but they evolved last. So these are the three things that can use photosynthesis. They all have to have chlorophyll. It's a required chemical. Now, the vast importance of photosynthesis, very, very important process, because all food webs begin with the plants, as they're the only thing that create food. They're the only things that can turn air into food. Everything else just eats plants or eats an animal that ate a plant. Okay? So therefore, there'd be no animals can live in areas that lack plants. And you see this kind of like in the desert or in the tundra. Now, there is a few small number of plants, and that's why there's a small number of animals. But wherever there's a lot of plants, there's a ton of life. Like an example, the rainforest. Okay? You have animals everywhere because there's plants everywhere. But as you decrease plants, you decrease the number of animals. So plants control the likelihood of all other living things on Earth. Okay? They have to go there first, and once they go there first, then other things can start popping up. And when I say plants, I'm also talking about algae and cyanobacteria. It's easier to just keep saying plants. Now, if plants begin to fail, all other organisms will fail as well. If we lose plants, every living thing on Earth is going to die. Okay? Plants are under the ultimate control of life. Okay? They control every other living thing. It's why we study plants and why they're so important. So the big thing on here, plants are the only living things that can trap outside energy, the sun, into a stored form, glucose. There's no other thing that can do that, and we are all dependent on these plants and cyanobacteria and algae to do it. So the vast importance, just continuing on with photosynthesis, allows plants to produce a structural, like cellulose, and that's something we can't digest, and metabolic glucose substances that aid in their survival. So they eat their own glucose. Okay, they don't eat their cellulose, they use that for their body, just like we can't really process cellulose. So some examples of glucose made by plants is used for creating cellulose, and most of this glucose is converted to this to create the body of the plant. So then sometimes plants will store some of their sugars as starch, used for later in energy, and that's kind of what a potato is the plant took a whole bunch of its sugars and converted it into a storage form, starch. They also convert amino acids to make protein. But 95% of plants are really just made out of glucose. They're really just a whole bunch of glucose. You can get a little bit of protein from plants, but very, very little. And also, if you've never thought about it, that's the only where we get carbohydrates is from plants. We don't get carbohydrates from animals, or we get very little of them. If you want a carbohydrate intake, you're going to have to eat a plant. Most of it, you're just going to get carbohydrates. Okay, so the overall equation for photosynthesis, and this is something that you should know, is CO2 plus water. Okay, then we have to have energy because it's an anabolic reaction. Okay, and it will produce, what we got here, glucose, which is glucose right here, and oxygen gas. Okay, and if you look, simple molecule, these two right here, going into something complex. Okay, so that means energy must have inputted. And now I have all this energy stored in these bonds. So when I rip them apart during cellular respiration and I rip these bonds apart, I get all that energy back out, and that's what we use for it. Go back here, we're writing out the overall thing, but CO2 doesn't go right into into glucose. It's going to have to go through a whole bunch of different steps to process it and so on. Now, in photosynthesis, there is a ton of reactions, little mini reactions, just like there was in cellular respiration, and we're not going to be able to go through all the mini reactions, either fortunately or unfortunately, depending on whether you like this or not. So although the overall equation seems simple, there are actually about 100 little tiny chemical reactions that must occur. So, and that's what I'm talking about in these 100 chemical reactions. Now, we are going to simplify it, though, into 2 steps, and we're going to call photosynthesis a 2-step process, and that's where the name comes from. There's really 2 names in here. There's photo and then synthesis, okay? So then those 2 terms really mean something different. So the photo part is what we call the light-dependent reactions. So during the first part of photosynthesis is when you just trap the energy, okay? And we call that the light-dependent reactions because you need to have the light shining on it in order for them to happen. This doesn't happen in the dark. So during this stage, you basically just trap all of the sunlight, okay? So you trap all this sunlight into these things, which we're going to call carriers. You're going to learn a little bit about them. They're called NADHs and FADs, and that's really just a carrier of sunlight energy. Okay, so you trap it during the first part, and then after you have it trapped, okay, then you actually use what you just trapped. Okay, you use these carriers to actually make glucose, and that's the second part, the synthesis. So synthesis means to make. If you remember from grade 11, the reaction to synthesis reaction is you're making something. So we took the energy during part 1, the photo part, and now we're going to use the energy in part 2 to actually make glucose. And you don't need light at that part. You can do it in the absence of light because you've already trapped the light at this point. So you don't need it to be light outside in order to do the second part, and that's why they call it light independent, because you've already got the energy from the light, so you can start making glucose whether it's light out or not. And that means that you can create glucose at nighttime, but we can't trap light at nighttime. Okay, so we're going to briefly touch on these because next week it's kind of when we go into a little bit more in depth of each of them. But the first one is light independent. So in the first part, okay, all light is trapped and used to really kind of generate 2 energy compounds. It makes a little bit of energy, okay? But most of the things is it's going to create this carrier, okay? So it's going to take this little carrier of energy, NADPH. So we're trapping light, and you can kind of hear sunlight, and we're going to make a whole bunch of carriers. And this is really just kind of trapped sunlight over here. And that's the first part. So now we've trapped a whole bunch of sunlight, and it's light dependent because you need the sun out in order to do it. Okay. Now, once we've trapped it, part 2 is we now take that trapped energy, okay, and the ATP that we made, and we make glucose. Okay, and it's also known as the Calvin cycle. Okay, if you take bio first year, especially cellular bio, you're going to hear a lot about the Calvin cycle. Okay, this is all the things that you'll learn about. If we were in class, we would go through this whole cycle step by step. In some of the videos, they will talk a little bit more in depth about the Calvin cycle and the conversion, but we're going to make it a little bit lighter when we go through it. Okay, now I'm going to briefly go through this. This is not a key part. It is something that you do need to know, but I mean, I'm trying to pick out kind of the big things, so we're going to kind of show you where photosynthesis happens. So it happens mostly in the leaves, okay? So if you zoom in on a leaf, and I kind of done that in the picture right here, okay? Leaves actually have all these little, basically, openings called stromatas, and these are little gates, okay? I'm going to highlight this in a different color, or actually I'll use black, and this will just show up. So I'm going to kind of highlight them. If you look at my picture in the bottom right, okay, these are little openings, and they're called stomatas, and basically they can open and close, and they are really kind of responsible for gases. So releasing oxygen, bringing in carbon dioxide, okay, that's what those things do. So when we want to perform photosynthesis, the leaves are where it happens, and that's how they get CO2 in and oxygen out, is they use these little stomatas. It's basically the gas releasing mechanisms. Okay. Now, when we talk about the water, where does the water come from? It does come a little bit from the air, so humidity in the air can help. But most of the water for this reaction is going to enter the plant through the roots and is transported to the leaves via the veins. So we have to get that water up into the leaves, but we don't usually get a lot from it from the air. We get most of it from the ground. Okay, and actually, sometimes water vapor escapes from these stomata, and that's why plants have a hard time growing in like the desert when there's not very much humidity. Is water just keeps escaping out of there. Now, carbon dioxide enters the leaves directly through the leaves, and carbon dioxide and water enter the cells of the leaves, and then enter the chloroplast of the leaves where photosynthesis takes place. So just kind of showing you, when we look at this reaction, 3 of the components, glucose is going to be made, but then it's going to be transported out of the leaves and put somewhere else. Okay, so if we zoom in on the leaf, I'm not going to go through this, don't worry about this. This is a cross section of the leaf and kind of showing you where photosynthesis takes place. So if you zoomed in on a leaf and you kind of took a cross section of it, here you can see those little openings that I was talking about, stomatas opening and closing. And most of photosynthesis is going to happen in this little top area, but we're not going to have to go through this just because we're looking at the big points. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of skip over here. All right, now this is something that we should talk about. This is a chloroplast. So inside of the cells, we have a thing called a chloroplast. So this is, remember, inside a cell, you're going to have a mitochondria, Golgi apparatus. If you're a plant cell, you have something special. You have this thing called the chloroplast. And inside the chloroplast, that's where photosynthesis takes place. Okay? And there's a couple things that I'm just going to mention that, we're not going to really focus on, but it should be something that you're kind of a little bit familiar with. A chloroplast is this whole thing, and inside the chloroplast, there's these little discs, which we call thylakoids. Okay, and the thylakoids all stack up together, okay, and make what we call a granulum. And I know this is a lot of terminology, and that's why we're going to kind of keep going over it, or kind of quickly going through it, because it's something that you'll go through again next year, but at least something familiar with. So this is where photosynthesis takes place, inside a chloroplast. Okay. So just kind of putting this together, here's a leaf cross-section. You take the top cells, because there's going to be a whole bunch of cells in leaves, and not all of them can do photosynthesis. You take the top cells, which are green. Okay. You zoom in. Inside that cell, there is mitochondria, but there's also this thing called the chloroplast. And then if we zoom in on a chloroplast, there are a whole bunch of little, basically, discs. Okay. And if we zoom in on that disc, now we're right here. In this granulum. And this is really kind of where photosynthesis takes place. So it kind of takes place right here on this membrane, and then as well as inside the thylakoid. Again, just kind of a picture. You take a leaf cell, okay? You zoom in on a cross section, take one specific cell, look inside that cell, find a chloroplast, look inside the chloroplast, look even smaller, and now you've got the granulum from thylakoids. Just, again, don't worry if you're not really following along here. This is just more of telling you where synthesis takes place. Now, we talk just some resources for photosynthesis. An essential component for photosynthesis is energy used in the form of glucose. Okay, when we talk about this energy, okay, we've already talked about where water comes from the ground, CO2 comes from the air. The energy is sunlight. But we should know a little bit about sunlight. Okay, it's known as radiant energy or light energy. And we're going to kind of just briefly go over what sunlight is. Okay, so when you want to absorb light, what light is actually this thing called photons, and it's a whole bunch of these little packages of energy. So different colors of light. So if you look at light is actually a blend of a whole bunch of colors. And you can tell that by using a prism, or if you've ever seen a rainbow. All the rainbow did was take all the light and separate it out into all the colors. When we see white light, it's basically saying you put all these colors mixed together, and when they're all mixed together, it appears white. But you can separate them out, and a prism does that. And each color is really just another little packet of energy. So red is like that packet, orange is like that packet, and these packets are called photons. Now, white light is really just a mixture of all of them. Okay? And the color is determined by the wavelength. So if you have a really, really short wavelength where all these waves are really on top of each other, you get into the purples and blues, and then as you spread out these waves, you kind of go into your reds. Right? And again, these wavelengths travel in packets called photons. Now, the plants can only absorb certain photons. They can't absorb all the different packets of light. They can't absorb, say, green light. Okay? Plants can't absorb this photon. They can absorb the other photons, and they do it quite well, but they can't absorb this photon. Okay? And that's why plants appear green. is because instead of absorbing it, they reflect it right back. And that's why when sunlight or white light shines onto a plant, it looks in our eyes that it's green, because this is the only photon that hit the plant's leaves and then jump back and hit our eyes. The red photons went inside the plant. The orange ones went inside. The yellow ones went inside. The purple ones went inside. And since they all went inside, we don't see them. But the photon that reflects back is the color that we see. And that's about all colors. So if you look at, say, the color of the shirt that you're wearing, if you're wearing an orange shirt, that means all the other photons went inside and only the orange photons came back. And that's why if you've ever noticed that the color of certain clothing looks different under different lights, so sometimes they'll say inside a department store the shirt looked different than out in sunlight, because department store lights don't have all the colors. Okay? Or also if you use a black light will only illuminate things that are white, because a black light is only sending purple photons. Okay? It's only going to send purple photons in, and the only thing that will reflect those purple photons back is the color white. All right, I don't want to get too much into light because it's just a little bit background. So this is why I wanted to mention it. Plants, okay, absorb. So if we look at this diagram down here, this is showing you wavelength. So this is all the different photons of light down here, okay, and it's showing you that plants really like blue photons and purple photons, and they have specific chlorophylls that absorb those. So we have certain chloroplasts made of chlorophyll that absorb purple lights. Then you have different chlorophylls that will absorb these blue lights, and then different ones that are kind of getting into this aqua. And then see the area of green? There's nothing in there that'll absorb green. Okay? And then we get into kind of our orangey, and we have other ones that'll absorb orange and other ones that'll absorb red. Okay? So this is where plants grow best. So if you try to grow a plant under green light, it wouldn't grow at all. Okay, because plants can't absorb any green light, but growing it under a pure blue light would work, or growing it under pure orange light would work. Okay? Now, as these chlorophylls break down and they stop absorbing them, that's why in the fall, in the fall, chlorophyll A dies, okay, or chlorophyll B dies, or chlorophyll down here, we're going to call this chlorophyll C. Okay, and as chlorophyll C dies, it won't absorb orange and red light anymore, and without absorbing it, it reflects back. And that's why in the fall, when the leaves are dying and this chlorophyll starts dying, it stops absorbing the red and the orange, and then the leaves start appearing orange and red because it's not absorbing it anymore, it's reflecting it back. And that's why leaves change color in the fall. It's when their chlorophylls die. Okay. The blues and purples we don't really see because they almost appear black. Okay, a really, really dark purple or a black. And that's why leaves eventually turn black. Okay, so getting back to why we're even talking about this is absorption of light. Plants cannot photosynthesize under green light. Here's another way kind of showing it. This is what the light colors that they like. They like reds and they like blues. Okay. All right, again, I'm not going to go over this again. It's just a bigger kind of picture of the same kind of diagram that I went before. Okay, and don't worry about this. Okay, so that's it for our introduction of photosynthesis. If you'd like to do some extra questions, I'm not requiring it because this is a very confusing topic, but you could use the textbook to do some.